Secretary Pritzker, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're just back from Cuba with the president. I want to ask you about your trip and about trade. But let's first begin on this story in terms of the Treasury new rules. We had Treasury Secretary Jack Lew on at the end of last year, and he was very clear. We do not like when companies leave America to go find a better tax rate. We're going to make it much tougher. Why not just go back to the tax code and change the tax code rather than piling more rules after more rules?
Well, right now, you know, we don't have a lot of flexibility to be able to change the tax code. And so what the president's doing is taking action against folks who are trying to move their headquarters for tax purposes.
Right. But don't you think that at the end of the day, the reason that they're leaving is because we've got the highest tax rate in the industrialized world? So rather than, you know, putting more rules on, is it smarter to just lower the corporate tax rate? How come that's so difficult to do is really the question.
Well, once you address the tax rate, and obviously the Secretary of Treasury is the person who's the expert in this, is, you know, it's very complex, and there are winners and losers, so it's a hard thing to get through Congress. And in the meantime, though, the president's view is we've got to take action because we can't afford to have companies just decide I'm going to move to a different country because of shopping tax rates.
Let me ask you about Cuba. You've just returned from a trip with President Obama. A lot going on in the world while you were there. Tell us how the trip was and what your takeaways were.
Well, it was a historic trip, and it was terrific. We were really welcome. The Cuban people lined the streets and were really excited to have us here visiting, which was really phenomenal. What was amazing about what's happened over the past year since the president changed our policy and decided that we're going to engage is now you have direct flights to Cuba, you have Americans going to visit Cuba, you've got direct mail and direct telephone calls. So you've got a lot more people-to-people engagement going on between the United States and Cuba.
What did you make of the comments once the president came back? When we saw that, you know, the head of Cuba is basically saying, look, it caused disruption. I mean, I know that the people are happy. They want to change in their lives. But after you left, what happens then?
Well, there's a lot going on. What we've done is our administration, both the Treasury Department and the Department of Commerce, have changed regulations that are making it easier for certain businesses that are allowed under the current embargo to be able to do more business in Cuba. And also what is being allowed is the ability for us to be able to have greater people-to-people engagement, which is really important. The president's fundamental premise is if we engage rather than isolate Cuba, over time there will be change. And that's what's happening. Let
me ask you about engaging, for example, with somebody like a China. Because recently we've been seeing the Chinese allocate money in the U.S. We see that the Anbag Group tried to break up the deal between Marriott and Starwood. Your background is the hotel business, obviously, Hyatt Hotels. Talk to us about that, because I think that some people are a little worried that China is acquiring our hotels and other industries that should be deemed off limits to foreigners.
You know, I think that's an oversimplification. I think we have to recognize that we live in a globalized economy. American businesses are making acquisitions all over the world. Chinese businesses are making some acquisitions here. We shouldn't be afraid of that. What we should be doing is opening up our economy. That's why it's so important that we have new trade agreements. We want to make more opportunity for American businesses as opposed to be afraid and pull in our horns in terms of engagement.
Now, when the Chinese first acquired the Waldorf Astoria, President Obama said it's not going to stay there anymore because the rooms are tapped.
Well, you know, I wouldn't worry about one acquisition of one hotel. What I would focus on is, frankly, what is our ability to do business around the world by U.S. corporations. And, you know, we have a policy in our country of encouraging foreign direct investment. You know the reason why? It's because it creates American jobs. So one of the things that we've done in our administration is create a program called Select USA, where we actually, for the very first time, the United States reaches out to 32 target countries, including China, including Japan, including Australia and others, and saying, please to come and invest in the United States. Please create jobs here.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is exactly the issue that seems to be ripping apart the country, ripping apart, like, in terms of the Republicans and the Democrats. It's certainly ripping apart the Republican Party. That is what the impact of free trade is. Donald Trump obviously has talked about it a lot, feeling like the U.S. is always at a disadvantage when it comes to the deal with Mexico or trade with China. What is the answer to that? Because people feel that when you've got open borders, you've got foreigners coming in and taking American jobs. So it's absolutely just the opposite of what you just said.
Right. What's happening is what free trade does is create the opportunity for American businesses and American workers to sell our goods and services around the world. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is giving access for American companies to the fastest growing marketplace in the entire world, the fastest growing middle class. The middle class in Asia Pacific is going from 500 million to 3.2 billion in the next 15 years. This is a market we want our American companies to have easy access to. You know, what's happening is other countries are doing free trade agreements in the Asia Pacific. Their companies have the ability to sell their goods and services with no tariffs. We're at a disadvantage today. The other thing about the Trans-Pacific Partnership is it also raises labor standards in our 11 partner countries, as well as raises the environmental standards, which make American workers more competitive.
So why do you think Hillary Clinton seems to be backing away from the TPP? Is Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders basically pushing her to somewhere she doesn't want to go? Here's her quote back in June. "I don't think you are at all walking away from or ignoring the economic and commercial aspects of our pivot by saying we want the best possible deal for the American people. And I've said that from the beginning that I would judge the TPP on whether it protected the American worker, whether it raises wages, and whether it protected our national security." And that's exactly what Donald Trump says it doesn't do.
I disagree. I think the TPP is good for our national security and good for the American worker. And the reason is it's giving our companies access into the region. The more presence that we have in the Asia-Pacific region, the greater stability there will be in that region. And we're being welcomed. Vietnam wants us there. Malaysia wants us there. These are countries that are very important strategic partners for us. We're insisting if we're going to do more business, you've got to raise your labor standards. You've got to be more respectful of your environment so that our companies are not at a disadvantage. Also remember that today we don't have the kind of barriers to doing business in the United States. So,
but that's the problem, right?
No,
China has 10 industries that they deem as foreigners cannot own at all. You can't, and forget about owning more than 49%. That's not happening. But like defense, a foreigner will not be allowed to acquire a defense company in China. Like oil, like food. Do we have any protections around our industry?
Sure. We have a CFIUS program that if you're trying to buy a company that is critical to our national security, that goes through a government review. So the idea that we're not protecting our critical industries is a misperception. But what's important is to give access for our companies so that we're on a level playing field, so that we can take advantage of the fastest growing markets in the world, and our workers can benefit from those opportunities.
It's actually a really important point, because they've got 1.3 billion people for us to be selling to. So do you think then that we have a fair shot in China? America have a fair shot in China then?
You know, China's a very complex market, and one that we have to work hard on to make sure that our companies have a fair shot at.
We're not there yet.
There's work to be done.
Secretary, good to see you.